is the Adeptus Mechanicus faction focus today, and apart from one of their rules, almost everything else has been stripped away. Something I think is a good thing, but you may not agree if you're a Mechanicus player. The Mechanicus play a bit like the Battle Sisters in that they have this focus on their faith, plus a 6+ invulnerable save, and they play a lot like the Tau, because they have a 4+ armour save, but we'll get to that, and they have a focus on heavy firepower while staying stationary. Their army rule is the Doctrina Imperatives. The way this works in 9th edition is you get to choose one of 4 different sets of Doctrina Imperatives each battle round. At the start of the battle round, one of them gives you +1 to your ballistic skill, with the penalty being -1 to your weapon skill. There's the Conqueror Imperative, which is the same but reversed. There's the Bulwark Imperative, which improves the save characteristics of your units by 1, but reduces movement by 3 inches. And the reverse of that is the Aggressor Imperative, which increases move by 3 inches, but reduces the save characteristic by 1. It seems rather strange to have an army special rule that makes part of your army worse, so you need to pick very carefully. This wasn't the only rule they had, because if you had the Mars subfaction, then you also had the canticles of the omnissiah. Again, chosen at the start of the battle round. You would choose one that hadn't been chosen before already this game, and there's 6 to choose from, so you'd be choosing 5 throughout the game. You could have Shroud Psalm, which gave you light cover. You could have the Chant of the Remorseless Fist to get +1 strength, Incantation of the Iron Soul to ignore any modifiers to combat attrition, Benediction of the Omnissiah to get you to reroll 1 hit, wound, and damage roll. There was the Invocation of Machine Vengeance to advance and charge, getting an extra dice to do so, and the Litany of the Electromancer, which gave you a benefit in melee as the enemy was up -1 to hit you with their attacks. So there was a lot to cover, and every time I have fought against an AdMech player, they have forgotten, and I have forgotten, at least one of these at some point or another. Either to pick it to do for the battle round, or that it applies to every unit, or pretty much every unit in the army, and it changes each turn. So it is quite a lot to remember, whereas the Dark Eldar's ability, that changes each turn but it stacks, and the Space Marines ability changes each turn, but it's just a variation on which weapons have an extra point of armor penetration. That is something that was much easier to remember. Sucks for AdMech player that they had to remember all this stuff, but now at least it's going to get a lot easier because the army rule is the Doctrina Imperatives. Just that. That's pretty much the only rule that's sticking. So at the start of the battle round, you select 1 Doctrina Imperatives, and it no longer comes with any negatives. The Protector Imperative gives all of your ranged weapons heavy. That means in this edition, if you stay still, you get +1 to hit. If you move, there is no penalty. So that's encouraging you to remain stationary and fire a lot better. Additionally, each time a range attack targets your own unit, if you're in your deployment zone, then the armor penetration is reduced by 1. This got known as Armour of Contempt when it was applied to all of the different units with power armor. It's probably still going to be called that among players locally, and it's a little extra thing to keep your troops going, because you'll have better resistance to armor penetration and you'll be shooting better. Generally, the armor penetration only applies to units within your deployment zone and only against enemy range attack. The drawback of this, of course, is you're not moving out to go and take those objectives. But for any of your units that are wanting to stay back and shoot, this is a great one for early in the game. The other one is the Conqueror Imperative, which means that ranged weapons equipped by models in the unit get the Assault ability. That means you can advance and still shoot. Unlike in 9th edition, there is no penalty to advancing and shooting your ranged weapons with the Assault ability. So they just shoot normally and can be fired after you advance. In 9th edition, you could advance and fire ranged weapons with the Assault ability, but you would do so at -1 to hit. That -1 to hit is gone. And each time a model in this unit makes a range attack, if the target is within your opponent's deployment zone, improve the armor penetration of that attack by 1. So this could actually be quite useful on the first turn if you have long-range weapons and you can target enemies in their deployment zone, because they'll all be getting an extra armor penetration point. It's also very useful if you want to move up in the first turn to still be able to shoot, because you'll be advancing and then shooting. So personally, I would be choosing the Conqueror imperative for my first turn, and then the Protector imperative a bit later on, to keep my own units in my deployment zone much safer and provide that long-range support. Games Workshop's text then encourages you to sort of be defensive and then counterattack. I would go straight on the attack for that. The change now compared to the canticles of the omnissiah is that you can choose the same one again and again. So if you wanted a very fast army that wants to get into the enemy deployment zone and mess them up there, you can just keep going with the Conqueror imperative. There are only 2 doctrinas compared to the previous 4, and they have just been merged together and all the negatives removed. And this edition in itself, 10th edition of 40k, looks to be getting rid of a lot of the negative sides of playing the game. Things like, if you move with a heavy weapon, you're at -1 to hit. If you advance with an assault weapon, you're at -1 to hit. Things like that. It's now going for only positives. The army rule works quite a bit like the Space Marines 10th edition chapter tactics, but as an army rule instead of a detachment ability. However, the Space Marines chapter tactics, you choose one in your command phase. The AdMech, Adeptus Mechanicus, is in the battle round. Remember, that could be the start of your opponent's turn, so you need to be thinking ahead which one you're going to pick. They're still very much a shooting army. There's nothing here that gives bonuses to combat. And I also want to point out that Belisarius Cawl, couldn't make these names easy, could they? Doesn't have the Doctrina Imperative's faction ability. This is like I said with the Battle Sisters when I was more talking about the Leagues of Votann. I expect that units like Penitent Engines and Archoflagellants also won't have the faction ability that lets you gain a miracle dice on death. So all of those commentators were saying, oh, just take loads of Archoflagellants in units of 3 and Penitent Engines in units of 1, get them killed and get loads of miracle dice. I don't think that's going to happen, because you need the faction ability to do that. So here is a prime example of one unit that doesn't have the faction ability. The stratagems of the AdMech that have been shown off are tied to these doctrinas, which adds quite a bit of flavour. And this is where our 2 missing doctrinas have gone. The Aggressor Imperative and the Bulwark Imperative are now appearing as stratagems, and they tie in quite strongly to the idea that you're focusing either on defense or on offense and can't do both at once. So the Aggressor Imperative lets you advance and charge this turn, but you can only use the stratagem if the Conqueror Imperative is active for your army. So your whole army has to be doing the same sort of thing. You're not going to be having everyone standing still and shooting well, except for one unit, which is sprinting up the board, advancing and charging. But that does mean that at least one of your units is going to be advancing, shooting as normal, and then charging, which could be very powerful even if you don't do it on a close combat focused unit. And the Bulwark Imperative is here to give your units a 4+ invulnerable save, which you can only do if the Protector Imperative is in place and active. This may be something that replaces Transhuman physiology and rules that do that sort of thing, that only let you wound someone on a certain dice roll. Instead, just improve the invulnerable save. Invulnerable saves seem a lot more secure than before, because another rule that seems to be stripped out is things that get to ignore invulnerable saves. We haven't seen any massive Imperial Guard cannons that ignore invulnerable saves. We didn't see any of the many horrible Leagues of Votann weapons that previously were ignoring invulnerable saves still having that ability. So I think having these invulnerable saves is going to make you quite safe and very tough, far more than toughness 3 and a certain save that's changing would suggest. But let's look at the detachment next. The detachment rule is called Rad-cohort, and it essentially means you're doing a lot of chemical bombardment with lots of nuclear fallout. So at the start of the first battle round, for each enemy unit within your opponent's deployment zone, which is going to be pretty much all of them except for units that can scout, which you've already seen shown off with the Genestealers, or units that can infiltrate, which hasn't been shown off, but I'm assuming that that rule still will persist. Your opponent must choose whether a unit will take cover or stand firm. If a unit takes cover, then they are battle shocked. So a battle shocked unit cannot use stratagems or hold objectives. We don't know yet if you'll be able to score things in the first battle round. Currently in 9th edition, there is no scoring of primary objectives in the first battle round, just to prevent all of those armies that can take scouting and infiltrating units from having such a massive advantage. So it may be better for the AdMech's opponents to choose to be battle shocked, because the alternative, if you stand firm, is on a 3+, you take D3 mortal wounds. That's a minor inconvenience, but if you're a very tough armoured unit with lots of heavy infantry, or lots of small heavy infantry units, such as a Space Marine, that could be a lot of damage coming your way before the game has even started. With this radiation bombardment in the first turn, I'm wondering how that will interact with the Genestealer cult. Will the Genestealer cult still have a secret deployment? Now, the index cards that are going to be issued online, and the ones you can buy in store, will probably not have tokens that come with them. And the whole secret deployment thing was very time consuming. You would deploy at the same time as your opponent, but only as these little tokens, and then after the enemy's first movement phase, then you would deploy all of your models onto the board. It really slowed things down, so I'm suspecting for the Genestealer cult, I do like talking about the Genestealer cult, even when we're looking at other factions, they will probably not have the secret deployment anymore, and instead get something like better infiltration or better outflanking. And then from the second battle round onwards, at the start of that second, third, fourth and fifth battle rounds, roll 1d6 for each enemy unit in the opponent's deployment zone. On a 3+, that unit suffers 1 mortal wound. We are confirming that the battle does indeed still last for 5 battle rounds, unlike in 6th and 7th edition where it was between 5 and 7, or 5th edition when it was 6 battle rounds. It's going to be like 8th and 9th edition where there are 5 battle rounds in the game. So when you're playing against AdMech, you're going to want a unit with lots of wounds to be holding your home objectives. So 5 Space Marines. Remember that Space Marines are no longer going to have the ability that lets them have the sticky objectives. If they have a troops unit holding an objective and then move off, it remains under their control at the moment, under the Arks of Omen rules. That isn't going to be around anymore, so you're going to want that 5-man half-tactical squad to be sticking around back there, or an intercessor squad, if you more prefer the Primaris style. Alternatively, if you're other factions, you want something like 10 Imperial Guard soldiers who can just stick around, because even if they're taking a wound every turn from this fallout, they're still going to be at half strength. What you don't want to do is what I see several Dark Eldar players doing, and Eldar players, of having 5 Cabalite warriors or 5 rangers on an objective, because they could be entirely wiped out before the game ends, and a small amount of shooting of like 1 or 2 guns could mean that you lose the entire unit and stop scoring that objective. The way detachments have been working is this is how you get the flavour of a subfaction. So for the Adeptus Sororitas, the Hallowed Martyrs is their detachment rule, and that's very much fits into the Our Martyred Lady style of play. Thematically, this one only really works with one of the distant Forge worlds that is very rad-saturated, and not any of the major ones like Mars or Graia, Agrippina or Lucius. And it's quite nice to see along with the Skitarii Vanguard as something that's very radiation focused. It seemed odd that only one unit would be so radiation saturated, but all of the other ones in the AdMech army were not. Well, with your rad-bombardment, you get to start the day with some war crimes. But let's move on to those Skitarii Vanguard. Their own personal rad saturation still persists as an aura, and is very good against enemy battle line units. So while an enemy unit, excluding vehicles, is within 3 inches of a Skitarii Vanguard unit, subtract 1 from their objective control characteristics. This is different to their reduction of -1 strength and -1 toughness, which meant that the Skitarii Vanguard could shoot the enemies and stab the enemies at a push much better previously. Now it's all about objective control, and we're seeing again these battle line units want to be on objectives to get these sorts of bonuses and give penalties to the enemy. And I've talked about them in the previous faction focuses last week. So -1 objective control means that if there's an opposing unit that is battle line, such as termagants, their objective control per model will be 1 instead of 2, making it much easier for the Skitarii Vanguard to hold that objective. And if it was an elite unit, like Chaos Space Marine Terminators, well, now they're not even trying to hold that objective. So this rad saturation is about the closest you'll get to the current objective secured, where if you have your unit on the objective, the enemy doesn't count, unless they also have the objective secured rule, and then there's a bunch of different interactions following that. So that's quite a nice ability. One of the war gear abilities you can get is enhanced data tether, which means that each time the bearer's unit is the target of a stratagem on a 5+, you gain a command point, which for the 1 CP stratagems will entirely refund you that. We have an unconfirmed information that this is only going to be once per battle round that you can gain a command point. So when we're looking at Abaddon being able to potentially get 3 command points per battle round, that is going to be capped at 1. That's how it works currently in 9th edition, and I see no reason to suggest why it wouldn't be able to carry over into 10th edition. Your command points are going to be a very rare resource. There are much fewer stratagems that you can spend your command points on. All of the different weapon types that the Skitarii had are gone. So your arc weapons, phosphor weapons, carbine weapons, cognis weapons, radiant weapons, taser weapons, galvanic weapons, rifle weapons, nope, none of them. No rules for them. These have all been replaced with universal special rules, which is much easier for your opponent to understand, and much easier for you as an already previously overburdened AdMech player to understand. So the radium carbine is anti-infantry, which means that it'll wound any infantry on a 4+, which is quite good when it only has strength 3. Alternatively, if you want anti-vehicle, then choose the arc rifle, which is anti-vehicle 4+, so it wounds vehicles on a 4+, and it's rapid fire 1, so you get an extra shot if you're at half range, 15 inches. I'm wondering, if it's an anti-vehicle weapon, does it really need to be strength 8? It will let it work against monsters, but it also means that these anti-vehicle weapons we're seeing will still work well, if not better, when pointed against infantry. So if the choice for the Skitarii Vanguard is either an arc rifle or a radium carbine, I would stick pretty firmly with the arc rifle and have as many of them as I'm allowed in the squad. Looking at the Vanguard Alpha, their weapons have been made very generic. So even though you can have a sword or a maul or a gourd, which is all on the sprue, these are now entirely cosmetic, and it's just an alpha combat weapon, which is 2 attacks at strength 5, -1 AP. So almost like a power sword as we've seen previously, but they were -2 AP. The pistol also has become very generic. It's an archaeotech pistol, which does devastating wounds, so if you roll a 6 to wound, you cause a mortal wound instead of the enemy getting a chance to make a save. And it's strength 6, -1 AP. So all the different kinds of pistol have all been rolled into one. Doesn't matter what pistol and what sword, weapon, melee weapon you've given your alpha, they're all the same. I'm not sure how many other units will get this. We didn't see the options for the Battle Sister squad. I just assumed that since the superior could have a combi weapon from the sprue, that there would also be rules for a combi weapon included. Not necessarily on the data card, but on some war gear stats profiles, which usually appears at the end of a codex. That's looking a bit more in doubt. And these unit leaders are becoming a lot more toned down because they aren't getting separate wounds profiles, leadership profiles, and weapon skill profiles. Only the weapons themselves are a bit different. So it could be, as we may see tomorrow, the exarchs of all the different Eldar squads, which previously got additional wounds, additional attacks, they may not get them anymore, just having the unique weapons such as a Scorpion Claw instead of any of these characteristic upgrades. And much like I said at the start of this video, they have their 6+ invulnerable save, which comes from Bionics rather than Faith, as it is with the Battle Sisters, and that 6+ invulnerable save is included on their data card, rather than as an army special rule as something you need to remember. The thing I really want to point out that I've been teasing all video is that their armor save is reduced to a 5+ save, whereas previously it was a 4+ save and was part of the reason they played a lot like Tau. Tau players have already quite weak fire warriors with a toughness 3 and a 4+ save. If it was reduced to a 5+ save, then they're quaking at the idea that these fire warriors are now essentially just guardsmen, but with a pulse rifle. And that's how you get gue'vesa. And no one wants to have gue'vesa, or at least everyone does, but Games Workshop won't give us any models or updated rules since like 4th edition, when they appeared in a chapter approved, which was like an extra way of doing rules at the time, as was the style. I think the Tau will probably keep their 4+ save, as before them there wasn't really any armies that had a 4+ save. You either had 3+, like Space Marines, or 5+, like Imperial Guard and Eldar did at the time. that time being 4th edition. Moving on to Belisarius Cawl, not crawl. He crawls, he looks like he crawls with his tentacle legs, but he doesn't actually crawl. Belisarius Cawl. He has an aura, which grants Adeptus Mechanicus units within 6 inches reroll hit rolls of 1. And we're seeing that these auras are only applied for the bigger faction leaders, whereas in 8th and 9th edition, they applied also to like captains and lieutenants. No longer, they will confer their bonuses just to the unit that they join. So if you did want more of an 8th edition style play, then only use the units that Games Workshop is showing off, their regular troops and their faction leader. Characters like Abaddon, Cawl, and the Swarmlord. Generally, we are seeing fewer rerolls in favour of dice modification instead, so +1 to hit, -1 AP extra, things like that. Full rerolls are quite tedious. At the weekend, I went to Warhammer World and played against a Tau player who had a relic weapon or warlord trait that allowed them to reroll all hits and wounds, and when they were firing something like 20 shots, it was like 5 minutes in itself just to have this one model shoot. So we're seeing far fewer rerolls just to keep the game sped up. The one exception that we've seen so far is the Space Marines Oath of the Moment, but that is only rerolling hits and wounds against one enemy unit until the next battle round and a new enemy target is selected. We're also not seeing movement reductions, keeps things going much faster, so the Leagues of Votann didn't have their we ignore penalties to movement because they didn't need it. Terrain no longer reduces movement, except then we had the barbgaunts showing off, and when they hit something, they can slow it down, which means that their enemies that they can't kill, like Terminators, will instead be going 3 inches. So it's like a pinning debuff instead of actually being able to kill the tough things. Of course, anything lighter like Imperial Guard or the Skitarii Vanguard, they will be pinned and also probably be dead. We see that Belisarius Cawl isn't subfaction locked to Mars. So subfactions, the way they work in 10th edition, most of the flavour, as I've said, comes from these detachment abilities, where you get your stratagems from, except with these characters, where you can't have characters with different subfactions. So you couldn't have Marnius Calgar and also the Chapter Master of the Black Templars in the same army, as they're different subfactions. I already complained that the Battle Sisters are sort of fixed to our Martyred Lady, and that's going to persist for a while. I'm sure there'll still be Space Marine players who have something like White Scars. They will have like 1 whole month to complain about a subfaction being locked to the Ultramarine style before they get a codex, whereas the Battle Sisters, it's going to be at least a year before they get a codex. So I guess I'm playing White Armoured, our Martyred Lady. Oh well. When the Games Workshop faction focuses come out, they also show off one special weapon. So we have the Eradication Beamer, which has basically one profile that is a lot better. So think of it as getting extra armor penetration and an extra damage when you fire it on the focused half range. So at half range, more damage. That's about it. I had thought that Games Workshop might show off their character enhancements today. These are replacing character upgrades like becoming a Chapter Master and relics and warlord traits, but perhaps another time. The AdMech overall look a lot simpler to play. Just remember, are you going defensive or offensive for the whole battle round? And it's harder to think in terms of the battle round, especially when your opponent is going first. But good luck there to all the AdMech players, especially when it comes to their Radiation War Crimes Tribunal. And until you see me in the next video, have a great day of 40k.